is a video about messy edge stitches and enlarged last bind-off stitches. A lot of people have messy edge stitches but don't recognize them on their work, so first I'll point out what they look like. On this swatch we've got 12 stitches across, and the first column of stitches and the last column of stitches are considered the selvage stitches. Selvage stitches aren't very pretty because they're only connected to the knitting on one side. The other side is just loose. It doesn't have anything connecting to it, so they collapse in on themselves and they're not particularly attractive. Those are not the stitches we want to talk about. What we're talking about is the second column in below the second stitch on the needle. You can see that column. Those are the edge stitches, and those are what are going to be seen most prominently. For example, if you were going to seam this area, or if you were going to pick up stitches along here like the front of a cardigan and add a button band or buttonhole band, or if you were going to pick up stitches along here for a neckline or armhole, these are the stitches that are going to stand out. The ones, not the ones at the last column, but the next to last column. These look nice. See, they're the same size as the rest of the stitches on this swatch, but let's look over here on the right. This column is not so nice. They're what we would call messy or untidy. Every other stitch is enlarged. Can you see that? And this is the selvage edge. So this part would be hidden behind the pickup or the seam, but this is what you would see on the very edge, and it's really not very attractive. Unless you're looking for this, you won't notice it in your work until later on, and then it'll stand out like a neon light. So let's see, what causes this to begin with? It is caused by the action of creating the stitches. As you make a new stitch, you insert your right needle into the stitch on the left needle, and you insert the needle through this way for a purl or this way for a knit. But at the time that you're creating the new stitch, you actually have two needles going through that one stitch, and it pulls up extra yarn into the stitch. Then you create the new stitch, drop this one off. Let's do this as an example. So you create a new stitch. This one on the left needle is now dropped off. Then when you put your right needle into this stitch, any excess yarn that was pulled up into that first stitch is now transferred to this stitch. And so it becomes enlarged. And then it's transferred to this stitch, and so on across the row. Each stitch absorbs that extra yarn. And when you get to the end of the row, which we'll be at in a second, there's nowhere for that extra yarn to go, because these stitches are not connected to the ones that you're creating on the needle. They're actually connected to the row below. So if there's excess yarn, it will get stuck right here, and it will create enlarged stitches. Same applies. If you did have enlarged stitches on this side, you would be creating them when you worked the other way. So we're going to purl back. My problem is the stitches on the right. And when I just began that previous row, they were fine, but now I'm working these stitches across, and again with the right needle, when I pull up on that left needle and make that purl stitch, I'm moving yarn over from right to left all along. And then when we get over to here, again, there's nowhere for that extra yarn to go. And I do have that problem. It happens to me on my purl rows. It can happen on knit rows too, and it can happen on both sides for some people. Some people don't have this problem at all. So here we have those enlarged stitches every other row. How can you fix them? The first method for fixing it is when you're working from, if we want to fix the stitches on the right side, when we're working on the right side of the work, we have to tighten the first 2 or 3 stitches, so that when we come back and we're moving that excess yarn over, there's somewhere for it to go to, and the stitches will be normal size. There's several ways to do this. One is to just work these stitches really tight, but you have to be careful not to work that first stitch too tight, because watch what happens. If you work, this is the small stitch here, here's the big stitch, here's the small stitch. If you work this stitch really tight, the first one, and you pull so tight on it that it actually tightens up the yarn from the row below it will make this next stitch appear even smaller on your needle, and it makes the problem worse. So what you've got to do is when you work that first stitch, work it with your normal tension. Then the next stitch, really work it tightly, and I really pull the yarn around tight. And the next stitch, really tight. Then continue working back across the row. We'll go across real quickly and come back again. And I'll show you the next fix. There's 3 basic fixes, and you may have to try all 3 of them before you find the one that works for you. You can try these fixes on a right side row or a wrong side row. They'll work equally well, depending on where your problem is. So the next fix is a little bit different. Okay, now this time, that helped a little bit. This stitch isn't quite as big as this one. See how big this one is? Let me get this focused better. Okay, can you see how big this stitch is and how big this stitch is? This one's not quite as big, so that helped quite a bit doing that. The next method is to work the first stitch normally. Then when you put your needle into the next stitch to work it, before you wrap the yarn, pull the yarn tight. Then wrap the yarn around the needle and carry on across the row. That will tighten it up too. And I'm not going to work all the way across and back. It's too time consuming. The next technique is to work the first stitch normal, put your needle in the next stitch as if to make the stitch, wrap the yarn in the opposite direction. So instead you normally would go this way, you're going to go this way. What that does is it creates a very short distance from here to this darn, and makes a very, very short stitch. And it will absorb a lot of yarn when you come back on the next row. But you can see the stitch mount's reversed. So when you come back on the next row, you're going to need to work it through the back loop. For people who have really messy edges, they might have to do this trick twice, and that would be work the first stitch normal, wrap the second one in the opposite direction, the third one normal, the fourth one in the opposite direction, just like that. Then when you come back on the next row, you'd have to work this stitch through the back loop and this stitch through the back loop. Now at the beginning I said this had to do with enlarged bind-off stitches too. The same thing applies. What happens is when you're working across the row, and you carry that excess yarn over and then you go to bind off, there's nowhere for the yarn to go, and you'll have that big bind off stitch. All you have to do is employ one of these techniques in the row before, and you won't have that big bind off.